Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to be joining with my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Gadan, in today's crisis conversation with President Francisco Sagasti of Peru. Francisco Sagasti is a distinguished public servant who has also served in a number of academic and public policy positions in his country. He is an industrial engineer by training. He's taught at the Universidad del Pacifico's business school and also at Peru's Catholic University. He's the author of more than 25 books and more than 150 scholarly articles. President Sagasti, in his previous life, is the founder and former executive director of the Peruvian public policy research organization, GRADE, and he has been an advisor to a number of Peru's ministries, including industry, foreign relations, and education, as well as the National Planning Institute. He has also served his country abroad in senior roles at the World Bank and at the United Nations. Francisco Sagasti became interim president of Peru last November, following a tumultuous week in which Peru saw the resignation or the impeachment of two presidents. And he is leading Peru until the general elections that will be held this April and an eventual transfer of power in July. President Sagasti, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My first question is a question that's on the minds of all of us around the world, in the United States, but especially in Latin America, and it has to do with COVID-19. Peru at one time had the highest, and certainly one of the highest per capita death rates in the world. That has gone down, but it has seen over 1 million cases and over 42,000 deaths. The country is in the midst of yet another severe lockdown. The country has contracted with a number of providers of the vaccine, Sinopharm, AstraZeneca, and others, to have enough vaccine to inoculate the entire population. How soon do you see this getting underway? How widespread will it be in a way that can allow the country to renew economic activity? And what do you think that the impact of COVID-19 says in general about Peru's health sector overall?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Arnson. It's very nice to be with you and all the Wilson Center associates and scholars. I have been fortunate enough to be associated with you many years ago when I used to be at the World Bank and also at the Inter-American Development Bank. And it is a pleasure really to talk to you and to the scholars and policymakers associated with the Wilson Center. First of all, with regard to the situation that we had with COVID-19, I think that this, as with many other countries in the region and in the world, caught us unprepared. And in the case of Peru, severely underprepared. Why? Because during the sort of bonanza years of growth of the 2000s and the early 2010, we did not invest enough in the health sector, in education, and in other social sectors. By some reason or other, we thought that this would continue almost indefinitely, and that sort of growth will trickle down automatically and produce changes in the provision of basic social services. That didn't happen. So when the pandemic hit, we were really unprepared. And in spite of taking measures and adopting policy measures that included a severe lockdown very early, we were not able to withstand the first wave of contagion and of hospitalizations and unfortunately of deaths. We are now in a second wave, which is caused by a variety of reasons. First of all, the movements of people during this holiday season, which is something that has happened everywhere. But in addition to that, we have these new varieties and these new I don't know how to call them, but basically different mutations of the virus, which appear to be much more contagious, and evidence is now emerging that they are more deadly. We do not know enough about them to be able to say that they are the ones that are causing the present situation of really a second wave, which has already surpassed the first one. The only way to forestall this is the vaccine. And when we started the government on November 17, there were practically no formal agreements signed, just sort of letters of intent. And in the case of COVAX facility, a framework agreement that needed to be corroborated and ratified with each provider within the COVAX facility framework. So we set to work very hard. We started really in early December because the cabinet was confirmed in early December. And by January 6, we had already completed the first of several firm agreements. We now have enough vaccines agreed with Pfizer, a very important provider, 9.9 million vaccines. Part of that is going to come through the COVAX facility, and the largest part directly. We also have a firm agreement with AstraZeneca, which will come during the second half of the year. And we also have an agreement with Sinopharm, which has already delivered 1 million doses, which are now being deployed and applied all over the country. When we'll be able to vaccinate the whole population, it will depend on how the agreements that we sign are unfold over time. You know very well, in the US, in Canada, and in Europe, we have seen supply problems. Most vaccine providers had not anticipated the pipeline problems in terms of logistics and securing all the inputs that are required in order to manufacture a very complex vaccine. And they also underestimated the scaling up process from laboratory and pilot plants to mass production. And this has resulted in a massive undersupply of vaccines for all providers. In that context, and with this I will finish, we have tried to negotiate the best possible deals with a variety of suppliers to ensure at least that we have the whole amount of doses that is required to vaccinate the whole population. Whether we will be able to do that this year, even if we have all the doses, will depend on a complicated logistics, which would require scaling up daily vaccinations from an average of about 10,000 a day, which has been the tradition in Peru, to about 80,000 a day all over the country. So we face quite complex challenges, but my government and what we are doing is to design ways of addressing them, not only during my very short term, but also preparing the ground for the next president, Dr. Aronson.
Thank you very much. I have to ask you a follow-up question. We're obviously aware of the impact of the so-called vacuna gate, the vaccine gate, which has hit Peru, in which hundreds of politicians, former government officials have received the doses of the vaccine in advance of the general population. And I would be interested in knowing how you have responded to these revelations and how it's impacting your broader anti-COVID efforts.
Well, this is something which is highly unusual. It's an aberration, really. Peru has a very long tradition of carrying out clinical trials for various medicines and especially for vaccines. We have had a long tradition since the mid-1990s of conducting clinical trials for a variety of vaccines, measles, even, I can't even remember, I was given a full list. And all our protocols are well established, clear, very well known, and Peru is a preferred country in order to do clinical trials for many drug manufacturers. For example, the pneumococcus vaccine, in the case of Pfizer, was tried in Peru and was one of the first vaccines approved against pneumonia and so on. So that is the case. The clinical trials that went on with the vaccine from Sinopharm were administered to 12,000 volunteers. Those trials have gone perfectly well according by the book, with everybody signing a consent agreement with a follow-up meeting. We had one adverse incident and the whole trial was stopped until that was cleared very, very quickly, and then it continued. So the normal clinical trials are proceeding perfectly well without a hitch, just about finishing, and they are preparing the final report after opening all the envelopes and figuring out which of the volunteers got the vaccine or got the placebo. So let's separate those 24,000 doses for 12,000 people that have been going on with no problem. What happens is something that is irregular, in the sense that an additional amount of vaccines was requested and used in theory in order to immunize those who were taking care of them and really organizing and administering the vaccine during the trials. I have asked experts, this is not a usual thing, but at the same time, it's not something that hasn't happened before. If you're going to administer a vaccine as part of a trial, if you desire and are willing to take the risk, and you are a medical doctor or a nurse, and if you ask for a vaccination, that happens sometimes. It's not something that is highly. So there was a request for a certain number of doses for that purpose. But this was completely outside of the clinical trials because they were real vaccines and were really distributed according to criteria that are now being investigated. When I came to the government, all of these had already been done. Decisions had been made months before. The doses had arrived, and decisions on how to allocate them have been made by the previous administration and by officials in the various ministers. So the first thing we're doing is setting up a commission and an investigation to find out exactly what happened, what is the timeline, who made the decisions, and especially who made the decisions on whom to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. This is irregular, this is outside, and one of the things that we have decided quite swiftly is to separate any public official that was involved at any stage in this irregular process, including 2 former ministers. And I have the privilege of having 2 very, very qualified, experienced people replacing those 2 ministers. One is Oscar Ugarte, who has been previously a Minister of Health and is an internationally known medical doctor and a specialist in public health. And the new Minister of Foreign Affairs is someone that you know well, Alan Wagner, who has been one of the top foreign policy officials in Peru for many years. So the way we have dealt with this is to separate it completely from the regular study, to set up an investigative commission, and to give information to the Auditor General and to the judiciary, and they are carrying their own studies and providing us information. At no time until all of this erupted, I was informed or aware that these additional doses existed and that these additional vaccinations were carried out. We only found out when a former president declared that he had been vaccinated with an experimental vaccine because it had not been approved even as an emergency vaccine by the authorities of Peru or even by the authorities in China. The Chinese authorities approved that on December 31st, and we did that a few weeks after when we examined all the data and all the information. But these vaccinations, most of them, the largest amount, happened during September, August, September, and October of last year.
Benjamin.
President Sagasti, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I want to talk about the upcoming presidential election in Peru. There have obviously been several presidential transitions that Cindy has referenced, and yet another is on the horizon. There is still no clear front runner in the presidential contest. The latest polling data that I've seen shows that the leading candidate has the support of more or less only 10, 11% of the Peruvian population. My question for you is whether you perceive the candidates as addressing the issues you believe Peruvians want to hear from their future leaders. And if they are, why is it that no candidate has captured the public imagination? One of the interpretations that you hear is that this is yet another sign of the alienation that separates Peru from the traditional political parties and from the government and political system in general.
Well, not only by law, but by conviction, I am sort of required and committed not to comment on any candidates or candidacy for the presidency. The only thing I can express is my own experience when I was elected congressman in just about a year ago. What happened there was a very, very tight election with the party that got the largest share of the votes got about 12% of the votes. And a party that got sort of and was able to go over the 5% minimum that is required to have access to Congress was just about 7%. So there was only 4 percentage points within which 9 political parties managed to squeeze through to parliament. That difference was translated into 25 seats for one party and just 8 for another. What I'm trying to tell is that we probably should expect something similar to happen on April 11 in Peru. In other words, the situation in Peru, and I believe that is also similar in other regions and in other countries of the region, is that there is not a great deal of enthusiasm from one or another political party. As I said, in the case of the elections on January 26, 2020 for parliament, what you saw is that the party that got the largest share of the vote got support only from about 12% of the population. And this is going to be something which is going to probably continue during the next electoral process in Peru.
I'm just wondering, Mr. President, why you perceive this lack of enthusiasm. Why is the voting public so divided amongst these parties and candidates, and why is there such a sense of disconnect between the representative institutions and Peruvian democracy and the needs and demands of the Peruvian public?
Well, I think there are several reasons for that, and by the way, the reasons are similar in all other countries of the region. As you know very well, in the Wilson Center, the political disaffection or the disaffection of the electorate and citizens with the political parties is generalized. It's not just a Peruvian case. And I think has to do with quite a clear disconnect between politics and citizens. I think there is something quite unusual going there. And I don't know the reasons. I mean, I remember discussion with my dear friends who are experts in Latin America during many, many years in Washington, in California, in Boston, in New York, and so on. And we have never seen such a situation in the last at least few decades that I've been following Latin American politics. The discontent and the lack of confidence in political parties and in politics in general is really quite widespread in all the region. In the case of Peru, one of the reasons why this is the case is because we have practically all the former presidents indicted in jail or abroad waiting as extradition. Only one alive president has escaped all of that. And it is really a tragic situation. This disconnect and the conception that one acquires political power, is elected to do whatever they want for their own good is a complete change from what it was when I began to be interested in politics as a student. At that time in the 60s, you really enter into politics to serve, to really think of the common good, the public good. It seems now that after the 1980s, you enter politics in order to improve your own well-being, and then by accident, perhaps, the well-being of others. And I think there is a need for a regeneration, for a complete change of mindset in Latin American politics, to reconnect political leaders with the people, to reconnect them not just with promises, because this is the other tragic thing. When they try to connect, quote unquote, with the general public, with the population, what many politicians do is lie. They simply tell them things that they believe the population wants to hear, even though they know they are not possible. And I have seen this happening as a congressman in Peru, when legislation is being passed and we are told that that's unconstitutional, that is not going to pass, don't do that. No, the people need this, they want, and so on, and we have to do it. But you know it's not possible. You know it's not possible to, for example, with the pension systems, to return the money that someone contributed when you have a contributing pension system. But nevertheless, they pass the law. And they know very well that this is not going to happen. So there is a kind of, how we call it, false connection, quote unquote, which is made on the basis of promises that they know are not going to be fulfilled, but they win votes and they just simply get there. And once they get there, they try to do whatever chicanery or whatever until they are caught, as many have been caught. So we need a complete regeneration of the political system and to return to a situation in which politicians are elected to serve the country, not to serve themselves.
Thank you for that. And the question or your comment about the pension system, I think, takes us right to a broader set of questions about the Peruvian economy. Peru's economy was one of those in the region that contracted the most sharply last year as a result of COVID, and yet is predicted in this year to grow at the fastest rate, according to the IMF. And I was wondering if you could reflect on how the Peruvian economy is set to recover. Is that simply because of the demand in China for the traditional Peruvian export of copper? And what specific policies have you and your government put in place to shield, especially informal workers, some 70% of Peruvians who work in the informal economy, a percentage that is actually quite a bit higher than the rest of the region?
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting question that requires a very long answer. So I'm trying to do it by bits, because otherwise we will take a very long time. First, some facts. Peru has had one of the most responsible fiscal policies for more than 20 years. The terrible experience of the hyperinflation and economic crisis and terrorism of the 1980s really left a mark. And fiscal prudency and the maintenance of fiscal rectitude was considered essential, and it's now a hallmark of Peruvian economic policies, and the independence of the central bank guarantees that. So that it's on the good side. Second, we grew very fast during the commodities boom of that started in 2002, 2003, primarily fueled by China's demand for primary commodities and food and others. And during that time, Peru really grew at a fantastic rate. And as I said earlier, we believe that that is going to be sort of a permanent situation. We sort of kidded ourselves, sort of deceived ourselves that this was a new normal, without realizing that we should use those revenues in order to improve our social services. By the way, and you mentioned that I have been doing some policy work for some years. I wrote repeatedly during 2002, 2004, 2006, articles, papers, books, and so on, suggesting that we should use those revenues in order to really reinforce completely institutional arrangements in the social and economic sectors, to invest heavily in science and technology, to invest heavily in education. Instead of that, we had one after another corrupt governments that invested in mega projects that did not do anything. And we had one president that is awaiting extradition, another that committed suicide, another that is being indicted, another that is under house arrest, and another that has one or two constitutional accusations. We basically threw away that opportunity. Nevertheless, in spite of that terrible situation, with regard to economic policy and the responsibility of top political authorities, Peru has an enormous advantage that we are not really fully aware of. First of all, has the demographic dividend. We still have young people in the workforce who could really help us grow and consume. 70%, as you said, are informal. I really try to avoid the word informal because this is just a label that hides an enormous diversity of situation. Informal in Peru is an established corporation that has half of its payroll on the black, which is not paid for. It is an informal. Yeah. And at the other extreme, an informal person is a street vendor under a traffic light, which is trying to sell sort of candy. And in between, we have a whole range of self-employed people that generate their own livelihoods, of entrepreneurs that are entrepreneurs, but do not generate enterprises because they last only 2 or 3 years. They don't have the training, the expertise, they don't know how to even do accounting and so on and so forth. And they really create their own jobs and as independent. All of that is the informal sector in Peru. We need to be much more fine-tuned to the demands and characteristics of each sector of the labor force. So what we need to do in the first place is to divide the labor force that we have and figure out what type of training, support, information, financial assistance, marketing assistance they need so that the jobs that they generate for themselves are productive, useful, and improve their livelihoods. At the same time, we need to generate new opportunities in new areas of work. Peru is a country that is blessed with a diversity of natural resources. People say Peru is a mining country. I said, well, yes, but it's also an agricultural country, a fisheries country, an energy country, a water country, a forestry country, a soils country, an ecosystems country, a diversity country. We really have an enormous range of possibilities in terms of economic growth. And what has happened over time is that when opportunities have opened in one of those areas, we really have grown very fast. But up to now, without a strategy, a deliberate policy to support those involved in those activities. This is a very complicated background to explicate and to provide an explanation. Why is it that Peru, first of all, grew very fast, then had a very severe contraction when basically the opportunities for work for those entrepreneurs and those that sort of create their own livelihoods were suddenly curtailed. The moment that the possibility of coming back out of quarantine happened, this sort of grew again. And at the same time, we had a favorable external environment in terms of demand for a basic product. So everything combines in Peru to really provide us with opportunities that we have not taken. We are, as Jorge Basadre said, the historian, a country of lost opportunities. We shouldn't do that anymore. And I see a very rapid recovery, but if sustained with the right strategies and policies, Peru could really zoom up and become one of the leading countries, not only in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of social conditions and the quality of life.
Mr. President, I want to turn, if you would, to foreign policy for a moment. It's clear the tensions between the United States, a critical ally of Peru, and China, an important trading partner for Peru, have not gone away following the US election in November. My question is how you and your administration have been navigating relations with both superpowers to avoid disrupting these two critical diplomatic and economic relationships. And of course, I recognize this is not simply a challenge for Peru, it's a challenge for most of your neighbors in the region related to a diversity of issues from the Belt and Road Initiative to the participation of Huawei in 5G infrastructure development.
Well, the first thing to do, Dr. Geran, is to get out of the outworn mindset of the Cold War. If you insist, or if you think that is one or the other, as it was in the case of the Soviet Union and the US, or you are with me or you are with the other. I mean, we are in a different world. We have evolved towards a multipolar world where the policy situation has changed. It's not a question that if you are with me, you are against me anymore. So let's get that out of our mind. It's not a question of choosing between the US and China. It's a question of working productively and with confidence with both countries. Both are very important for different reasons, either historically or economically or social, and also in terms of political affinity, but we have very much in common with both countries. So we don't see this as a problem. Quite the contrary. I think that perhaps Peru, that has very good relations with both countries, could be a place where you could come with a delegation of China and a delegation for the US and sit in Peru in one Chinese restaurant or in a McDonald's and negotiate under the auspices of some Peruvian policymakers. So I'm just sort of making this a little bit of light comments because we do not see it as a question as it was during the Cold War. We want to maintain the excellent relations we have had with the US in economic, in fighting against drug traffic and in fighting against organized crime, in terms of the mutual relations, trade relations we had had for a long time. And we also have a very long tradition with China. The Chinese immigration to Peru antecedes Chinese immigration to the US. They started coming to Peru in the 1850s. I think that in the case of the US was 1 or 2 decades later. So we also have a very long tradition. One of my sons-in-law is of Chinese origin, and so on. And some other friends are from American origins there. So we see no need to choose. We see both partners as very good partners to help each other to maintain very good relations. And this is what we shall do with Peru, with the United States and with China.
Thank you. Let me continue on that tack of relations with the United States. Do you think that average Peruvians or Peruvian leaders have a specific set of issues that they would like to see a response from the Biden administration? I mean, what are the most important aspects of the bilateral relationship? And then since President Biden himself has made the issue of climate change and the green energy transformation, environmental issues, such an important part of his platform, but also his vision about how to cooperate with Latin America. I want to ask you about climate change. Peru is a country that has seen a lot of the effects, the melting of glaciers that provide fresh water to the major cities on the coast for agriculture. What would be something that the United States could do to help Peru address its climate change challenges?
Well, in the first place, remember, Peru was the host to COP20. We really are committed to fight, to do whatever we can to force out climate change, which is unfortunately now a reality. You know, my dear old friend Maurice Strong, we had many discussions and conversations with him, with Ignacy Sachs, those who organized the 1972 Stockholm Conference and then the 1992 Rio Conference, in which issues of climate change were brought to the table. The position of the US has, until somewhat recently, to put it this way, very much in favor of combating and addressing climate change. And we welcome that re-engagement of the US because it's a re-engagement that ensures that not only Peru, that the world in general will have a better chance of confronting the challenges of climate change. There are many things we need to do in that regard. Peru has made several commitments with regards to decarbonization, with regards to deforestation and so on. We are going to need a lot of help from the US in the areas of combating deforestation, especially when it's related to drug trafficking and other things like that. We are going to need a lot of technical assistance. I know firsthand the top people that you have in many areas. For example, you mentioned the issue of glaciers melting and water issues. Now, we would like in Peru to address the water issue in a much more strategic way. Yes, the glaciers are melting, but we have a huge amount of water at the other side of the Andes with the Amazon River and the Amazon River Basin and everything in it. How can we use that in a more rational way? We're going to need technical assistance, help. And one of the most important things that we're going to explore with the US, unfortunately, as you said, my government ends in just 5 months. So we are going to leave all of this, I hope, prepared for the next government. But we really want to invest in science, technology, innovation, and higher education. We have a huge deficit in the number of PhDs and high-level researchers, and we need to train them very fast. One of the most important things that we could do jointly with the US, and not only with the US, but also with other more advanced countries from the scientific and technological point of view than Peru, is to engage in agreements to train people either personally or through agreements that we can go back and forth, fellowships, joint research projects, and so on. So I do hope that in the near future, we'll be able to address climate change, but not only climate change, food security, and many other issues like that through collaboration in higher education, science, technology, and innovation. And this is one of the priorities of my government of transition and emergency. And I hope that it will be able to engage the US very actively in this regard.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you know, Peru has played an important role in coordinating the regional response to the Venezuela crisis, including through the Lima group. Are you confident the next Peruvian president will continue to focus diplomatic resources on Venezuela's political impasse and the human rights challenges in that country? And are you satisfied with the role regional leaders have played thus far in helping to promote a peaceful solution to Venezuela's political crisis? I'm also curious if you have a moment to talk for a bit about the Venezuelan refugee crisis and the way your government has managed the crisis regionally, but also in Peru, where public opinion has been strong regarding the very large number of refugees who've settled in Peru.
Well, with regards to the first part of your question, Peru has a very professional and well-established foreign service. We have sort of state policies that continue regardless of the government changes in government, and a very professional, and the presence of Alan Wagner now in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs ensures a very smooth transition to the next government. So I would expect the policies that Peru has had with regards to the Venezuelan situation to continue. At the same time, we have to be aware of what is going on in the real world of international politics. The Lima Group was created to assist the opposition in confronting and helping to make a peaceful transition and a negotiated agreement between the current government and the opposition. Unfortunately, the opposition has not been able to present a unified front, which has made it more difficult to address this issue. We are exploring how to continue with the work of the Lima group, but there are also other groups as well. We are collaborating very closely with the European Union in terms of figuring out what next steps to take in Venezuela. There is also Prosur. So rest assured that Peru will continue to be engaged in helping Venezuela to find a peaceful transition to its political, well, humanitarian, economic, and social crisis. With regards to the situation of Venezuelans in Peru, yes, you're right, we have a very large Venezuelan migration. And unfortunately, just a few bad elements which have really engaged in delinquency, in crime and so on, have made the headlines all the time. And they are really shadowing, they are not shadowing, but really not allowing us to see clearly the enormous contribution that many hardworking professionals, doctors, and other Venezuelans have made through their immigration to Peru. So we are aware of some problems and at the same time of the contributions they have made. We face a very tough and difficult challenge on how to integrate those migrants into the Peruvian economic and social life at a time of crisis. But I am heartened by the response that we have seen from many social sectors that are helping and trying to figure out ways of assisting the migrants. From the government point of view, what we are trying to do is, first of all, to avoid having undocumented migrants. Unless you have them registered, they are not able even to benefit from the minimum basic services they deserve as human beings, and as we and other countries in the regions are committed to provide as part of our international humanitarian agreements. So we are making an effort to register them, to avoid illegal immigration, and to really find a way of supporting. At the same time, we're trying to confront xenophobia. It's very clear, because there are some cases in which Venezuelans are seen as displacing Peruvians from jobs. This is happening, but not to such large extent that most people believe. And we are trying to organize ways of showing the contribution that they can make. And finally, what we are doing is being very, very vigilant and strict with those Venezuelan immigrants who give a bad name to Venezuelan immigration by committing crimes, by assault, and all the underworld that unfortunately sometimes accompanies these huge and very large migrations. Even a small percentage can give a bad name to the whole migration process.
Did you find that the decision, very well received internationally by your counterpart in Colombia, Iván Duque, has helped you provide the sort of generous reactions that you've just described in terms of documenting Venezuelan refugees, providing them with social services?
Well, I think this is more than just one. As you know, there are 2 or 3 countries that have bear the brunt of the migration, but this is a humanitarian crisis that requires a broader intervention of all the countries in the region, of the United Nations and humanitarian organizations, and also civil societies. No country by itself can solve a problem on such a scale. And what is worse, and one of the things that we're realizing, is that even if we are able to effect a change of regime or government in Venezuela and to really reach a peaceful transition of power, it will take a decade or more for Venezuela to return to a rate of growth and of social development that will allow people and the Venezuelan people to sort of go back to the levels of life they had and the standards they used to have. So this is a crisis that will continue for a long time and that requires a regional commitment, an international commitment to help a country surmount a humanitarian crisis that has no precedent in the region.
President Sagasti, I would like to, if I could, go back to a point that you raised earlier about the things that you were writing in the early 2000s at the beginning of the commodities boom and the path not taken by Peru in terms of making the investments and the structural and institutional changes that were needed at the time. I'm wondering if you could reflect, and this is not just a question for Peru, but really for the whole region, how confident or not confident do you feel that all of these great sort of brechas, divisions, inequalities that have been revealed by the pandemic will be things that will be addressed going forward by regional leaders?
Oof, that's a very difficult question because it depends, first of all, on a regeneration of our political life. And I trust that the younger generations will go back to some of the principles I described before. The commitment to public service, the commitment to solidarity. We have lost that. We have lost values. I mean, perhaps I sound like an old sort of an old person that complains about what has been lost. But it's not just that. Even younger people, researchers realize that in the region, we have lost our way. Those values, those ideas that inspired many generations in the region, equality, freedom, equity, opportunities for all, gradually have been eroded because of the prevalence of an individualism that basically says, I have to take care of myself because that's the only way. If I am well, then gradually all the other ones will be well as well. I mean, it seems that they read only the Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith and forgot to read the theory of moral sentiments. I mean, this is just unbelievable to me. I am confident in the next generations. What I have seen in Peru, at least during the last several weeks, during the uprisings in which many young people spontaneously gathered in order to protest to a change in government that wasn't justified at that moment. Perhaps with benefit of insights, there were some things that could have been done better in those protests as well. But I am hopeful, and what I'm trying to do is to show that in spite of having the sort of bad track record of presidents that my country have, it is possible to still have faith in a president that believes in the public good, that believes in honesty, that will end his terms as rich or as poor as he began his term. What we need to show is that it's possible to have decent politics, that politicians are there to serve the people. This is what is required at the moment. And if you allow me to go just for a couple of minutes more on that, one of the things that I found years ago when I was trying to do my studies on Peruvian strategies, Agenda Peru, looking forward in the 1990s to Peru in 2021, where we are now, we try to figure out what are the ways in which you can change the values, the attitudes of people. And we found three. Education, of course. Second, the media, what you see there. And, obviously you need education. Obviously you need media in order to be able to avoid fake news, to really be truthful and so on. But the third one was the most powerful one. And this is the power of example. People follow the leaders they see that are successful. And if a leader steals, and if a leader is corrupt, and if a leader lies, then that becomes the new normal. So the most important things a leader can do is to give the example of honesty, good behavior, really being transparent, and so on. And I think that's the most important change. We need to have political and business and civil society leaders that have a different mindset, a mindset that is oriented towards society. I was recently looking at something that one of my schoolmates from high school sent me, and it was a short video of one of our teachers in the La Salle school, La Colegio La Salle, in which he was reminding the students 30 years after they had left the school, the values that were instilled in them. That's what we need. And if during my brief period, I can do something to show that you can govern decently and with the purpose of serving the people, I think that's the only thing that I can do and hope that others will do as well.
I imagine that there are a number of Peruvians that wish you were standing for the elections in April.
I'm too old for
I know that interim presidents are not supposed to do that. Benjamin.
Thank you, Cindy. President Sagasti, before we conclude, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the role that free trade will play in Latin America's economic recovery. Peru is a member of the Pacific Alliance with Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, and of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, has long looked to exports for growth. But as you know, the external environment when it comes to trade is quite complicated. The trade war between the United States and China remains unresolved, and there's trade protectionism increasingly popular even in parts of South America.
Well, and I think that one thing that we know very well from experience and from theory is that free trade, when it is really free trade and well administered, is an engine of growth for everybody. The question becomes a little bit more complicated when you have very large conglomerates or corporations that have subsidiaries in very different parts of the world and which engage in free trade, but doing transfer pricing between their subsidiaries, taking advantage of low tax or low regulation situations. So what we really need to do is to have free trade as it was originally conceived. But we need to adapt our trading system into a new situation in which during the globalization period that we had in the 1990s and 2000, a number of corporations grew tremendously, especially in some sectors, and now dominate completely some sectors of production with subsidiaries in very different parts of the world. So we need to adapt our free trade conceptions and policies to a very different environment than the one we had in the 1990s. In the second place, what we need to do is that to have free trade agreements is not enough. If you don't prepare your country to take advantage of those agreements, then they are just simply paper and others will take advantage of you. What do I mean by that? If you are going to export to other countries through a free trade agreement, you need to have quality standards. You need to have regulatory standards. You need to have high technology. You need to have good productivity and so on. And there were some people who thought simply if we just open trade, then automatically everything would follow. That doesn't happen. You require government policies to support all those other conditions. You know, quality control, high productivity, regulatory standards, environmental standards, and so on. So free trade needs to be followed, but it needs to be adapted to a new setting in which domestic policies to complement free trade policies are extremely important, but international agreements to regulate the power of very large corporations which are taking advantage of free trade agreements, it's necessary to curb their power and to put some regulation in place at the international level. I know that's difficult because trade nationalism, as you pointed out, is growing, but it is essential. Otherwise, we simply would say mantra, free trade, free trade, free trade, and without all those two other complementary sets of policies, really what you will do is provide more power to some corporations and some countries in which they are headquarters, and at the same time, the inequalities in terms of income, trades, and benefits obtained from free trade are going to be on the increase. So you need to do two things. And this is an area, just to complete the argument, in which what I said earlier about what the US and Peru could do together, we would need some new partnerships in the area of science, technology, innovation, quality control, regulation, and so on, to help us to take advantage of the free trade agreements that Peru has signed and will be signing in the future.
President Sagasti, you've been very generous with your time. We've promised your staff that we wouldn't abuse your time. So I'd like to ask if you have anything to add that you don't think that we have covered in this conversation. And if not, simply thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Latin American Program, the Wilson Center, we do appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much. The only thing I have to add is that as someone who has benefited from studying in the US, from working in the US, from visiting and knowing and having very, very good friends there, I am sure that the good relations we have always had with the US will continue under President Biden, and that they will be strengthened, and that we are going to find new ways of strengthening our cooperation in a way that is mutually beneficial. And at the same time, I welcome the regeneration of American politics in the same way that we are trying to regenerate Peruvian politics at this time. The only difference is that President Biden has about 4 years to do that. I have 4 months.
No time to spare. He should get to work. Thank you so much, President.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.